Okay, I think we're going to go ahead. Let me welcome everybody who's on this evening. We have a lot of people who have registered who haven't signed in yet, and we will try to get them in as we are going, but I don't want to hold up everybody else any much longer. But welcome this evening to all of you who are signed in. This is a follow-up Livability 22202 meeting to our July 30 meeting, where we did the broad overview of the 4 working groups. And this is the promised follow-up meeting on Route 1 connectivity. Next slide, please. This is the agenda for the evening. I'll just go over it very briefly with you and then a few ground rules before turning it over to our first speaker. But I am Carol Fuller. I'm the president of the Crystal City Civic Association, for those of you who might not know me. I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to our attempt to reach out to the community, to give you information that we have to share with you on Route 1 and to get your ideas back. This is a first meeting. We will have a second meeting on September 30th, at which point we're going to be asking the bid to make a presentation. But tonight is for the community. Tonight is for everyone to be able to understand where we are at the moment, what we know, and throw out some ideas for you to consider. And then we will be doing a survey at the end. Everybody who is registered will be getting a copy of the survey for your ideas to put it in. So we will be going shortly to the proposed working group goals on Route 1 that Mike Dow will be talking about. Then we will have a brief introduction of the survey by Dana Bress. Then we will have a very brief background on the 22202 neighborhoods with a connection to Route 1 on the history. Then we will go into a series of ideas that the working group has come up with. These are just ideas at this point. Nothing is written in stone. Everything is just being put out there for consideration. Then we will go into the VDOT feasibility study status and community opportunities that Arthur Fox will be talking about. We will then have a discussion period that Eric Hassel and Emily Norton will monitor. And then we will have a wrap up and talk about next steps. Next slide, please. Just very briefly, these are the ground rules for the evening. We have over about 120 people who have registered for the meeting tonight. So we ask you all, as a matter of courtesy, please to remain muted and to keep your video off unless you are called upon to ask a question during the discussion period. The presentations are going to be followed by a Q&A, and you'll be able to ask questions throughout the presentations via the Zoom chat function, which you can find on the bottom of your screen. Please do not unmute yourself, however, for a question until you're called upon by one of the meeting hosts. The broadband sometimes gets bothered when there are too many people with videos, and it gets noisy when people have their microphones on and dogs barking in the background. So please be respectful when you're using the chat function and asking questions of our presenters. So with that as background, next slide. I'm going to turn it over to Mike Dowell, who is going to now start in with our agenda on the livability goals. Mike, it's yours.
Great, thanks, Carol. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm Mike Dowell with the Livability 22202 effort. And thanks for coming tonight and participating in this meeting. So just as a quick review, about a little over a year ago, the Livability effort started organizing and started with a framework of principles and then moved to an action plan. And in that action plan, the livability priorities were identified. And those consisted of the housing affordability, essential services, environmental sustainability, engagement, arts and culture, and the multimodal transportation network. And if you look at that last bullet, you'll see that one of the key areas was improving Route 1 east-west connectivity. That came out in a couple of early workshops that the community did, in which we were asked to identify barriers to building community and getting to essential services through our zip code. And Route 1 kept coming up over and over again. As you all know, Route 1 is a difficult road to get across. We have some limited access across that road. Some of the access ways are through the underpasses. Some are street level, and so this was a big concern for the neighborhood. And so we got to the point where we've arrived at doing this dedicated workshop. But it's not just a multimodal transportation network. This also has aspects of how we cross that street, the environmental, how does it look, does it feel biophilic, can we accomplish that when we think about east-west connectivity? And it also impacts our access to essential services. So it's not just being able to get back and forth across the street. And of course, it's not just about cars. It's about being able to walk places, be able to ride our bikes places, about getting to other multimodal transportation modes such as the metro and the buses. So that's where this east-west connectivity traces back up to some of the fundamental livability priorities that we have in this community. Can you go to the next slide? Okay, so then we do a bit of a drill down from those priorities and start to look at the east-west connectivity itself. And these are some proposed goals. So what we thought we'd do is to go over these a little bit right now. And as you listen to the presentations tonight and you have some ideas on are these the goals that we should really be driving for? Would you modify them? Are there additional goals? You can get those into the chat window and respond to the survey. So to hit a couple of them, obviously, we want to have a safe means of getting across the road. We all know the 23rd Street pedestrian crossing feels quite unsafe. It's not an easy way to get across Route 1. So we want to make sure we can get across that road safely. We're looking not just for young folks to be able to get across that road, but older folks and young folks too. So if you think about it, we need a new school in this area, and that school is going to end up on one side of Route 1 or the other. And so we got to think about how are we going to get school-age kids back and forth across the road without having to, essentially put a bus service in place. Looking at some other ones, the local business community. For years, I think we've had not as great access to the underground and to Restaurant Row on 23rd Street because of the difficulty of getting back and forth across Route 1. And when you look at the growth area coming in this area, we have a lot of retail on either side of Route 1. We have a lot of people living on either side of Route 1. We want to make sure that everyone can get back and forth. Okay, next slide. Okay, a few more here to just keep in mind. Obviously we want the traffic to be able to move on Route 1, and we want to be able to get back and forth across that road. We certainly see some spillover even today from Route 1 traffic onto East Street and sometimes into the neighborhoods on Fern Street. So getting Route 1 right is really important to our community. And that means it's got to be, data driven. We don't want to come up with a solution that is not supported by analysis. We got to make sure that because Route 1 is a Virginia state road, that we have solutions that respect the jurisdictional authorities. We want to make sure we're going to do this once and not have to do it over in a decade. Moving to the last one, we want to make sure all the sidewalks, all the pedestrian ways are in keeping with best practices. And then the second to the last one is one that really want you to think about as we go through tonight is when we have our goals, we don't want to put in a point solution. We want to have goals that hopefully get us to a couple of different solutions that we can evaluate. And so that gives this working group and the community the prospect of not just one solution, but a couple of solutions that we can weigh against one another and come up with the best decision. Okay, so that's the overview of the proposed goals. Keep those in mind tonight as you listen to the presentations, and I look forward to getting a lot of input back from everyone. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and this is Dana Bress. And one of the things we need to do is we need to find out how the community uses and crosses Route 1. We all have our horror stories about problems we've seen with it. But so what we've done is we've crafted a small survey. Next slide, please. That will look at the holistically look at the full length of Route 1 in Arlington County. We're not starting at 23rd Street. We're starting basically at 4 Mile Run, and because most of us both cross Route 1 as much as we use Route 1 as a thoroughfare, we want to help. We want to understand your priorities and your issues. So we have a Google Form survey that's up, and we will email the link to y'all and provide it to the civic association members, civic associations for their members as well. Next slide, please. And basically what we're trying to find out is, where do you live and work? Where do you cross Route 1? And where do you avoid? We all have our favorite crossings. I fancy 18th Street. And then we have the ones we avoid like the plague. And both of those are important, because the ones that everybody avoids probably are the ones that that the planners need to look at harder. And then what are your priorities? Do you cycle across Route 1? Do you walk? Do you drive? And so this survey is going to be up for a couple of weeks. And we encourage everybody to participate in it, so we can maximize the input from the community members. Thank you.
Okay, turning it over to Emily Norton.
I realized I started talking and I was on mute. Hi, everyone. I'm Emily Norton. I'm currently the membership director for the Crystal City Civic Association, and happy to be part of this Route 1 committee. I've lived in Crystal City on and off for about 8 or 9 years, so I'm very familiar, as are many of you, with some of these complicated intersections. So tonight I'm going to present a very brief overview of our section of Route 1. Could not have done it without Pam Van Hine. She is our resident expert in all things Route 1, and hopefully at some point she can give us a longer presentation for nerds like me who enjoy this. So I'm going to turn off my video. I just wanted to say hello so you can see what I look like for bandwidth reasons. Alrighty, next slide. So until the late 19th century, 22202 was a very rural area comprised mostly of plantations, estates, and farms, which later turned into industrial sites. And the primary business centers at this time for local farmers and landowners were Alexandria and Georgetown, including their ports. The Potomac, the Alexandria Canal, and the Alexandria-Georgetown Road were key transportation links from this area. Part of this road later became Army-Navy Drive. Next slide. The Washington, Alexandria, and Mount Vernon Electric Railway started in 1892, linking Alexandria and Mount Vernon. It later expanded north along what's now Eads, providing convenient commuting transportation from our neighborhood. Addison Heights, the oldest part of Aurora Highlands, was platted in the late 1890s by the Addison Heights Development Company, but development really picked up in the early 1900s. Next slide. World War II, the New Deal, and World War I, World War II, the New Deal, all caused major growth spurts in the local population and urgent needs for new roads to connect the community to the larger metro area. The population of this area doubled by the end of the 1930s, doubled again by the late 1940s, and continued to grow in the 1950s. So developers responded with a housing boom, filling up the rest of Addison Heights and expanding into Arlington Ridge and the rest of Aurora Highlands neighborhoods. So Route 1 in Northern Virginia originally began as a rough, mostly unpaved road connecting Richmond and DC. It was fully paved by 1927 and gradually added lanes starting in the early 1930s until its current expansion to 6 lanes completed in 1986. Improvements were also made throughout that time to support the opening of National Airport in 1941 and the Pentagon in 1943. Shirley Highway, which is now I-395, opened, and Route 1 north of 12th Street was realigned and expanded as part of the Pentagon roadway improvements. Next slide. Until Crystal City started to develop in 1963, Route 1 wasn't a barrier because residents had very little reason to cross it. Residents lived west of Route 1, and everything they needed was either in their neighborhood or available a short car drive away during the post-war, very car-centric era. But by the mid-1970s, the metro was being planned, and the county started encouraging smart growth in the form of high-density, high-rise development along these new urban metro-accessible corridors, obviously Crystal City, to take advantage of the metro access and begin to build and support an environment less reliant on cars. Since then, alternative transportation modes have kept increasing. So in the neighborhood, walking and biking are increasingly popular and better supported by safer designated spaces, including some of the bike lanes you all use and see. Rapid transit lines such as Metroway ensure that buses can move efficiently in the neighborhood so riders can reach their destinations basically as fast as driving. And then a variety of other mini modes of transportation. I'm thinking, you know, the scooters that you see everywhere and probably drive us nuts that you're not tripping over them on the sidewalk, provide new options for first and last mile travel. Next slide. So there have been a bunch of opportunities and challenges. Obviously, 9/11 was very devastating to the community. And then after that, we all dealt with the base realignment and closure, or BRAC. So each of these incidents provided a variety of economic and different challenges and led to a lot of vacant commercial real estate in the neighborhoods. But then in November 2018, Amazon announced our area would be its new HQ2, bringing about 25,000 new employees to the region over time. So this announcement increased the need for more housing, especially affordable housing, or to maintain some affordable housing, and a more supportive transportation network for this influx of new residents and workers. Improving Route 1 was actually one of several transportation priorities in the HQ2 proposal. However, now we're in this new COVID time, which has no clear end in sight and likely changes some of the trends that we had been leaning towards in the past. So we now need to focus on creating spaciousness for socially distant, safe areas, such as the green space in parks the community is working on in the Open Space Initiative, which is another part of the Livability 22202 initiative to maintain green space and parks. COVID has been a challenging disruptor, but it also provides a unique opportunity to reimagine everything in a different way. The future of our community has a ton of potential, and the population is expected to increase. The current Arlington County profile projects major growth between 2010 and 2045 in the Richmond Highway corridor. Population is expected to increase about 85%, housing units about 90%, households 87%, and jobs about 27%. And this is key to note, these projections were produced before the Amazon announcement. So clearly the increases are probably much more at this point than these projections. So transportation options will grow as well in ways we cannot necessarily imagine, but we need to plan for them now. Next slide. So basically, in conclusion, once the high-rise residential and commercial buildings were built in Crystal City, residents on both sides of Route 1, east and west, needed to get to the other side safely, whether by walking, biking, or driving. As I think it was Dana who mentioned, I live on the corner of 23rd. I hate crossing that intersection. I saw a horrible accident there the other day. We all have our preferred routes. So the project that we're working on right now is to redefine Route 1 so that it's not a barrier and it's often a safety hazard to all people traveling across it, whether we're walking, we're biking, we're driving. And I think this project will give us the chance to make it better for everyone, even now and then going into the future. So that's the conclusion of my quick history, and we'll take it away from there.
Thank you, Emily. We'll turn it over now to Darren Buck for the working group ideas.
Hi, everybody. I'm Darren Buck. I am a 10-year resident of Aurora Highlands and a few years in Arlington Ridge before that, a few years working in Crystal City before that. I am a professional transportation planner, but my qualifier, I am definitely not here representing my current employer. I am here as a resident who is really interested in this project and is sort of eager to see what comes out of it. So I wanted to talk a little bit about some ideas, and I'll take my video off and also let you know that unlike last time, I do not have a pizza on the way, so I should be able to talk uninterrupted. So we want to talk about some ideas that of what we could do with Route 1. I should tell you, I'll qualify them at the end, but I'll qualify it up front as well to say that these are really ideas. We did a sort of in discussions, we tried to weed out things that we just knew weren't going to happen, but these really are kind of unconstrained by a lot of reality. They're really trying to get to what could we do that would address some of the needs that we discussed in our last presentation, some of the identified things that we are concerned about with the at-grade proposal, and start to toss around alternatives. So this title slide here, this is a former elevated 7-mile stretch of freeway that was entirely removed to restore a drainage creek and provide an iconic linear park through downtown Seoul, South Korea. We are not going to propose a full freeway removal of Route 1, but I just thought this was a really nice before-after picture to sort of whet your appetite. Next slide, please. So let's talk about the project itself. We went over this last time. This will be a review for some of you. So as part of the HQ2 process, Virginia committed to spend some amount of money to upgrade the Route 1 streetscape. The first project that's coming out of that is from 23rd northward. And so from that, most notably, they're proposing to remove the elevated sections of Route 1 and create new full 4-way intersections at both 15th Street and 18th Streets. As a reminder, right now, traffic can get off and on Route 1 at 15th, but through traffic goes through without stopping. Route 1 doesn't intersect at all with 18th. It just goes overhead next to the Crystal City Metro Station. You might remember a couple of news stories late last year when this was first released by the county as first part of the HQ2 process. And, you know, there's some concerns. Construction may be possible in FY27. VDOT has just awarded a contract for preliminary engineering to look at this study stretch, this 23rd to 12th stretch. We expect outreach from them to begin very soon. Arthur will tell you about that a little later. Next slide, please. So, reminder, this is what Route 1 looks like. And the two intersections in particular in question, 15th and 18th. And there's the bird's eye view of Route 1 looking south towards DCA. It's not the prettiest. Next slide, please. So last time we reviewed some of the potential impacts as we saw them based on what little we know about the project, the potential impacts of lowering Route 1 to grade at 15th and 18th. I'm not going to go over everything here, but I've bolded what we thought were sort of the major positives and negatives with that rough plan to delay, safety, the aesthetics and personal comfort aspect, transit impacts, and the development potential. Next slide. So, last meeting, Mr. Matusek, county planner for the area, told us that the Route 1 project is gonna be wider than just considering the at-grade option, and that's great. So we took that license and we ran with it. And we sort of started thinking about what we could do other than just simply dropping to at grade. So we wanted to introduce some new ideas. Again, some of them are a little out there, but let's get talking about them. That could form the basis for different plans either at particular intersections or segments, or for the whole Route 1 corridor. So think of these as concepts that maybe work in one place, don't work in another, maybe something that's more suitable for a whole corridor treatment, who knows? So the first broad idea is to think about what we could do to enhance an elevated Route 1. So this first example is from Zaanstad, the Netherlands, and they built retail and other sort of uses into and under the abutments of the bridges before placing the road deck on top of them. So this grocery store here, for example, it sort of helps to liven up the space under an elevated roadway that, I mean, frankly, this doesn't look a whole lot different geometry-wise from 18th Street next to Crystal City Metro. Next slide, please. Here's another very similar example. It's not nearly as attractive. Bad pictures. It's hard to find pictures of it, but in Portland, Oregon, under the Burnside Bridge abutment, where Portland has a light rail stop, they also have a retail space for the transit system. Photos aren't great, but you get the rough idea. It improves upon and somewhat enlivens the underbridge part of an underpass, just like 15th and 18th Street. Next slide, please. So our second sort of more broad idea is creating a bit more open space under an elevated structure. So many places have used the open space under bridge structures that are held up by piers, sort of big vertical columns instead of just abutments, the big hills of dirt that divide east and west here in our area. So this space under the Granville Bridge in Vancouver, British Columbia is a great example. It's got buildings fronting in this view onto a street that runs under the structure. It's worth highlighting two things in this picture that Granville Bridge has that we don't. It has a lot of vertical clearance or headroom, and it has that really nice vintage steel girder structure. It is an attractive bridge. Next slide, please. Here's a future concept that I believe is under development for another portion of Granville, where development actually fronts onto open space for the community. And we all love our shade and open space. It's shaded from day one. Next slide, please. Another example of this sort of open space use. This is a more famous one, the Borough Market in London, England. Note again, there's this very nice vintage steel trellis structure of the bridge overhead that carries rail. Lots of roomy headroom. Again, to replicate this would require rebuilding our elevated highway to be even higher, which is somewhat counterintuitive, but prettier, which is not hard to do because, let's face it, it's pretty ugly as is. Next slide, please. Finally, another example of sort of this activating open space. This is under a highway, a section of Interstate 10, which in New Orleans, they formally studied whether or not they should take down that viaduct. I believe they ultimately decided to maintain it and make better use of the space underneath. Unlike some of the previous examples, this bridge structure itself isn't particularly attractive, but it's still a bit more open than on our underpasses, and it's used. Next slide, please. So third, this is kind of one of my pet ones. Can we consider running Route 1 under some cross streets instead of over or through? So there's a wildlife crossing structure shown on the left, upper left, or those of you who might know India Point Park in Providence, Rhode Island on the right. This could enhance east-west connectivity for all modes with the addition of obviously the sunlight of removing an overhead structure, but also giving you the chance to introduce biophilia that these cross streets don't have now. This would be a particularly compelling option at 18th Street South, as I've produced a very crude sketch on the lower left. There are no intersecting car movements now to accommodate with ramps. However, a big potential limitation here for this option, and some of the ones to follow, is the unknown factor of the Metro Tunnel under 18th Street and exactly how deep it runs. I have heard anywhere from 15 to 75 feet. So that's a big question for our friends at VDOT. Next slide, please. Here is St. Louis, a very similar concept. Imagine instead of a park that had a road, but they've broached a concept of basically an overpass park going over a highway at the foot of the St. Louis Arch. Next slide, please. So we've got what we're calling option 4A, which would take a substantial length of Route 1 and put it underground with a cap over it, with some combination of open space, development, and a small surface street for local access running over this sunken highway. Previous noted challenge of 18th Street Metro Tunnel applies here as well. Boston's Big Dig shown here it shows it's something similar, though the surface street is much larger than what our area would require. Big Dig overall was a far, far, far larger project than our stretch would be. Next slide, please. Here's another sort of more scaled option that's probably more similar to ours. This is from Denver. There's a concept to deck over a part of I-70 with parkland, surface access roads. What you see on the left is the current situation. It's an elevated freeway, runs right by an elementary school. And so this project, it's tearing down this highway, putting a wider version of it with toll lanes in a trench, and then decking over this 4-block section of it with a park that's going to be right adjacent to the elementary school. Next slide, please. Here's one from Jerusalem, Israel. Note the open space, new buildings, that nice little street with roundabouts. Those of us who like roundabouts, you're doing a screen capture right now. I love this little road. Anyway, this is all built over a pretty substantial highway, far larger than Route 1, and I believe also has rail running through it. Next slide, please. Clyde Warren Park. This is one of the few examples I'll show that's already built. This park was built over an existing trenched highway, and it was built to help sort of catalyze private adjacent development, which it as far as I know, largely succeeded in doing. So next slide, please. Okay, so our next sort of idea is kind of a twist on the previous one. It goes a little further. Can we imagine the entire Route 1, all of Route 1 below grade, with some combination of open space, development over top, but with no surface street, just relying on Eads, Clark/Bell, and the cross streets to handle sort of our intra-community motor vehicle access. Again, that 18th Street Metro Tunnel is the challenge, as it is the added twist of how exactly our community would access Route 1 in this scenario. This example here in Tel Aviv is actually under construction. It's a very substantial highway and transit line running beneath. You can see it's a pretty wide stretch, a pretty impressive project. Next slide, please. Another one from, again, overseas. This is a section of the Autobahn, a 2-mile stretch of the Autobahn in Hamburg, Germany. They are, again, putting that highway in a trench and decking over with a combination of parklands and homes. Next slide. Finally, this is an example from Seattle, which already has converted its waterfront Alaskan Way viaduct. They've put that in a tunnel. This concept is for a section of I-5, which already is in a trench, cutting through downtown. They're basically putting a lid on it to provide more development space and a little bit more green space. And finally, just over the river, in the district, a developer built 3 entire new city blocks over the existing Center Leg Freeway. For those of you before the 695 interchange project, and you went up the Center Leg Freeway and hung a right on New York Avenue to try and get to 295. That's what you go under now. It provided basically 3 entire new city blocks of city, reconnected F and G Street Northwest in the process. Next slide. So this is a little different from the others, and it's simultaneously maybe one of the most radical and most easy to do ones, where Route 1 is already at grade and where it might get converted to at grade, could our peak hour traffic that's going by on Route 1, could it function with 5 lanes as it does in Alexandria in the Potomac Yards area versus the 7 to 8 lanes that it does currently in our area? So Columbia Pike, shown here, it's a more aesthetically pleasing environment than our Route 1, safer environment to be outside a car than the 7 lanes that are shown in that HQ2 document. We would need, getting back to Mike's presentation about what our goals are, we need a lot of detailed traffic analysis on this idea, both to look at travel times, to look at the potential for side street diversions, but especially with many of us re-examining our relationship with being in a physical office. Is maintaining a big 7-lane highway, whether it's at grade or still going over our heads just for peak hour period traffic to drive through, is it still justified, and does it meet the needs of our community? Last slide. Nothing worth doing is easy, of course. There are issues that we know about, and there will be issues that percolate up as VDOT starts going through this process. First is finances. The state hasn't pledged probably enough money to carry out even the at-grade project. And VDOT, due to the pandemic and our radical recent decreases in driving, is in a budget crunch. So this project, regardless of what a chosen alternative looks like, whether the chosen alternative that we as a community maybe eventually come to, or a chosen alternative that VDOT comes to, or the alternative that JBG Smith and the bid, it's gonna have to rely to some degree on value capture. That is, developers, landowners who have a substantial stake in the community, where they are contributing to construction because it increases the development potential of land they control now, or it opens up new plots of public land for development, or possibly even there's some tolling aspect of the roadway. This is less a transportation project than a development project. And the calculus of what transportation or of what construction options return enough revenue to developers to cover that cost is complicated and probably unknowable to us. Tolling a road is complicated for entirely different reasons. Regardless, it's complicated. And we are kind of flying blind a little bit until such time as VDOT really gets into his work. So we mentioned the question of how much clearance there is between the Metro Tunnel and 18th Street. But for all of the options, there's also a huge issue of how they can be built and still maintain a road for cars and trucks to move. It's hard to demolish and rebuild a highway and yet still keep all of that highway traffic moving. Full shutdowns like our summers without Metro Rail, they just generally, that is not that's not something that VDOT usually considers. That's just not something that most state DOTs typically do. So constructability is a big question. And finally, traffic. Traffic. What would each of these options do to travel times? What would they do to the number of people who are trying to drive on Route 1? Would they divert drivers off of the highway onto our neighborhood collector streets? We all love to have, I think, fewer peak hour commuters driving through our community. If we slow them down and reduce capacity, are there alternatives available to others to turn to? We don't know. So all of these things are things we need to consider in coming up with what our goal is to hopefully come up with realistic, workable ideas for Route 1 so that we're putting something forward that can get meaningfully analyzed and meaningfully considered in this process. That's about it. I hope this helps, and I guess I will pass it off to, I believe Arthur is next.
Right, yes, but before we pass it off to Arthur, I'm remiss, I forgot to tell everybody that we are recording this session. which will be posted eventually on our Livability and our Civic Association pages, but we are also live streaming on Facebook, and hopefully it should be available there as well. So apologies for not seeing that in the first place. So now I'm going to turn it over to Arthur Fox to talk about the VDOT feasibility study and opportunities for community input. Arthur, you're on.
Thank you, Carol, and good evening, everyone. I'm a, excuse me, a 30-year resident of the Arlington Ridge Civic neighborhood. And so I am going to begin with just a little quick background. It was shortly after Amazon's arrival that we heard rumors that one of the many coming changes in 22202 might be the lowering of a portion of Route 1, but it wasn't until this spring that this rumor gained credibility when the Virginia Department of Transportation came out with an RFP seeking to engage a transportation think tank to conduct a comprehensive study of Route 1, as you've heard, between 12th and 23rd Streets, with an eye to making improvements that would alleviate congestion based on future transportation projections. So it was just recently, just last month, that a contractor was finally selected by VDOT for the study, which will broadly include analysis of the current and future 22202 development, albeit with a focus on land primarily adjacent to the highway, and the feasibility of dropping the elevated roadway to grade north of Cross Street 20 in order to create a so-called urban boulevard, whatever that means, that would involve eliminating the 15th and 18th Street overpasses, resulting at, and this is important, at grade traffic signaled Route 1 intersections, not unlike the current intersection we have at 23rd Street, which we, all of us, have our issues with. Adjacent landowners, by the way, are, as you might imagine, strong proponents of this particular plan that would enable additional development of land along the edges of the highway with pedestrian-friendly sidewalks lined by trees and retail establishments. In any event, VDOT intends to launch this study this coming month, September, and to engage the public with periodic briefings and a means for providing input. Exactly how that will be accomplished has yet to be worked out, but you can be assured that we will let you know as soon as we know anything, and that our Livability Working Group will be on hand and engaged in this process over the coming year. The study is expected to take place. Indeed, as you've already seen this evening, our Route 1 Working Group has already begun to prepare to interact with VDOT over the coming year by assembling a list of goals and a range of conceptual ideas for how the highway might be reconfigured in a manner consistent with the Crystal City Sector Plan. Next slide, please. So what you're seeing, and I hope you'll glance over this, and the coming two slides in a moment, were lifted directly from the sector plan at the pages indicated at the bottom of each of them. So this one, if you went to or downloaded the Crystal City Sector Plan, which is available on the county's website through the internet, you'll see that this particular quote comes from page 61 of that document. In fact, they represent almost the entirety of the sector plan's guidance for the improvement of Route 1. Next slide, please. The one takeaway you'll notice is that they do not call for the roadway to be dropped to grade. Next slide. Indeed, they explicitly call for it to remain elevated at both 15th and 18th Streets to enable safe and convenient connectivity between Crystal City and Pentagon Cities, of human traffic moving back and forth between the two, which is critical to the development of a healthy and livable 22202 community going forward. That's all I have to say at this point, and so I would thank you and turn it over for discussion.
Okay, let me remind everybody that during this discussion period, which will be monitored by Eric Castle and Emily Norton, the ground rules are that you should use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, stay muted and keep your video off unless you're called upon to ask a question, and be respectful when using the chat function and asking questions. But at this point, we can turn it over. Eric and Emily, it's up for you for discussion.
Alrighty, the first question from the chat room that we can, I think the other question has been answered hopefully. Is there a hope for a date, regardless of the solution chosen, for Route 1 makeover be completed? So I don't know who can, Darren, can you take that?
I can, the answer, I can give a long-winded version of we don't know. The only data point we know on dates is that as part of the HQ2 site plan development process, which was our first sort of official look at this proposal, it was an at-grade Route 1 was shown in the traffic forecasts for HQ2 in the year 2027. I don't know. I don't know that if that, I don't know that that is a feasible number. This is a pretty ambitious project that construction alone is probably a multi-year process. That's the only data point we know, is that it was shown in 2027 in the forecasts as being the condition of the neighborhood and at grade Route 1 in 2027. But I think we'd probably, I would expect that it would be later than that, but we'll probably hear more from VDOT on that once this process kicks off.
Okay, let's go. Christopher asks, maintaining some separation to protect walkers is a priority. I think just speaking for the group in general, we're certainly aware that different modes require, or it's helpful to have different separations. So that's certainly something that we're considering. There's the survey question. I'd encourage everyone to take the survey, which you can express those types of views, and we'll try to use those to go forward. Sheldon, I think is the next question. Who's the customer base for changes? What we're trying to do? So I'm not sure who wants to answer this. Dana, do you want to take a stab at that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the customer base, we have a pretty good handle on the residents of 22202. You know, we've looked at that as part of the livability study, and then certainly the JBG and Amazon are interested in maximizing both the economics and the utility of the entire zip code. So I think it's a combination of us and them, and then also all of the folks that use Route 1 to get to wherever it is they're going, either into the district or into Crystal City, you know, from Alexandria and Point South.
Okay. Second part of this question.
Yeah, so it's kind of, you know, on all of the above customer base.
Yeah. Second part of the question from Sheldon is there any interaction with VRE? I don't think VRE is involved in it at this point, but clearly there's going to be a connection between the new VRE station, Metro, and then up towards Route 1, so via a new park. So all that's a part of it, but I'm pretty sure that VRE is not in the loop as far yet. Do we know if the county board has any say in VDOT's decision to do the feasibility study, especially 15th and at grade? I do not know the answer to that. I saw Mike or Mr. Matuziak on the call. I don't know if he knows the answer to that. but I do not know if what the interaction of the county is. I don't know if anybody else does. Arthur, do you know anything that the county knows?
I do not, but Matt is the best source for that, to answer that question.
Anybody else?
Yeah, this is Aaron. I reached out to a bunch of county board members sort of early in this process. They are aware. I won't tell you who, but I know there is at least one county board member who is sort of watching this. I think the county staff as a whole is, I mean, there's fairly deep documentary history that they're coordinating with VDOT as you'd expect them to. You would expect county staff to be providing information on, you know, through their traffic models, on existing conditions, on projects underway. But I don't think if the questioner is sort of looking for a, you know, is the county, either the board or the staff, giving a definitive thumbs up or thumbs down to this prospect, we haven't heard that. And I think probably maybe one of the goals of this working group is to sort of clarify what a community likes and dislikes list might be, so that when the county board or senior leadership of staff are getting involved, we can kind of speak with a little bit of clarity on what the consensus issues are, so hopefully they can use that to form a basis of opinion.
Okay. Paul has a question. Trenching Route 1 is expensive and could be a deal breaker for Virginia. What are thoughts on allowing developers to build on some portion of the capped roadway to defray or contribute to the cost? There's been a variety of ideas on financing this. I know I've had a few. I've talked to Andy Van Horn about a few of those, but I'm sure that getting the local developers involved is going to be critical for this, and they're pushing, obviously have a big interest in this. I don't know if anybody else wants to take part of this. Has any other response to this? But they're certainly going to be involved, and certainly we see, according to the second plan, there's several large tall buildings, 20, 30-story buildings that are supposed to come out of redoing this. So I don't know if anybody wants to talk about the sector plan and development results. Okay, I'll let it go with that. Hopefully that answered your question, but essentially yes, is the answer to the question. The survey, don't forget to take the survey. From Marianne, is there a link to the VDOT study so we can understand what they're considered as traffic improvement? For example, improving car flow may become a detriment of pedestrians and cyclists. Arthur, is there a link to the VDOT study yet?
No, but I can say that the RFP and I'm hopeful that the contract also is asking the transportation study think tank to do traffic projections going ahead many years based on the expected development into 2202 that's already been approved or that's called for in the sector plan or whatever. We know that the sector plan calls for a doubling of the resident population in Crystal City. And so that would, if a lot of those folks are working at Amazon, let's say, in Pentagon City, they're going to need to be going east to west and west to east. There will be hordes and scores of people trying to cross either over, under, or on top of Route 1 in coming years. So VDOT is not going to arrive at any conclusions until they really have done a careful analysis of the increase in the population of 22202 and to the south as well. I'm hopeful. I do think that VDOT is going to, I asked VDOT to bring both the Council of Governments Transportation Planning Board aboard as a stakeholder in this study, as well as the City of Alexandria, to be sure that everyone's interests are reflected in the final study.
Okay, Christopher and Brian both asked about, as you build more and more roads, there's some idea that there's induced demand. So Darren, could you explain induced demand and what's the idea behind this?
Oh boy. All right. So induced demand, I think Emily she had a really good explanation for it. If you build it, they will come. if you build a road wider, usually building a road wider is correlated with a lot of growth in an area, whether it's caused or just correlation. If VDOT decided to blow out Route 1 to 9 lanes wide, that would open up development in Alexandria and Fairfax, because their traffic models would say, we can go ahead and build houses and apartments everywhere because it will not degrade traffic. It also makes it easier for you or me or anybody to, on a given day at rush hour, say, I'll just drive, because you don't have in the back of your mind, or Waze isn't telling you, oh, traffic is super congested. So that's sort of how it works, is when you, if you increase the capacity of a road, nature abhors a vacuum, and cars will come in to sort of occupy that space. I should say that just based on what we've seen in the HQ2 traffic analysis, I think the goal of this project is not so much to, I wouldn't expect to see a lot of looking to increase capacity. I think they are the goals of the project. I don't want to put words in VDOT's mouth. I think VDOT's goal is really to sort of maintain traffic flow and not introduce a whole lot of intersection delays, particularly if they introduce new intersections onto Route 1, but also not necessarily blow out the road. So I'd expect that your travel time, if you're a Fairfax resident, it will take you maybe 30 seconds or a minute longer on average to traverse this area in the morning peak on Route 1. But I don't think they're looking to decrease that travel time. And I don't know. I think we're looking more at sort of the reverse of induced demand, where if you do introduce congestion into Route 1, what happens to the traffic? Does the same number of cars simply divert to other routes, or do people find new ways to get to work in the peak hour? Take off.
Okay. Paul asked the next question. Bringing Route 1 to grade seems to make east-west connectivity a lot more difficult. Why is it being considered? Raising it higher, lower seem to be the only way to make east-west connectivity better, so why not focus on those two options? I think there's a couple of things going on with the at-grade one. One is cost. I think the idea of making it even deeper or above might be a little more costly, so that's one reason why it's, I think it's on the table. And the other way is part of this is also, and I think everybody needs to think about this, what vision do we have for the area? And so if you bring it at grade, you have a certain vision, maybe thinking Wisconsin Avenue or Kinetic Avenue, where you have a big street with tall buildings on the side and very heavily developed. So it's kind of depending on what kind of vision you see for the area. So that's another reason why there's a different focus. Anybody else want to add to that? Dana?
No, I haven't got anything on that one.
Okay. Marianne, we don't have the link for the VDOT study. She asks, is there a link to the VDOT study? We will get it out to you as soon as they get it out. And so we're concerned about the car flow and the bikes and the peds and the cycles. Definitely considering that. Emily, she's trying to answer it. Matt Matuzak responds, the county staff is coordinating with the VDOT to ensure they have most accurate date for their modeling purposes and alignment with the Pentagon City Planning. They expect to be heavily involved. So Matt Matuzak is a county planner, and so he's a county employee who's giving us some additional information about how the county is interacting with VDOT in that comment. An observation for Earl. One of the questions that I don't know who wants to take this about COVID. How could COVID affect traffic volume? Obviously, there's a concern, well, what happens once COVID's over, which hopefully happens, but does anybody want to take an idea of how permanent shifts might occur because of COVID? Dana or Darren? Arthur, anybody want to have a quick?
Nobody knows. I know VDOT's been publishing traffic data fairly regularly on just what the traffic impacts have been so far. And while they've slowly recovered, the last bit of traffic to recover is peak hour traffic. So a lot of the volume, we're going places on weekends, we're going places in the evenings, but our typical 9 to 5 return to office peak hour commute, that's the little chunk of traffic volume that doesn't return. And so when that comes back is largely dependent on if and when people start going back in the office. I was a 5-day-a-week go to the office person. I didn't drive, but I would. It's going to be a long time, if ever, if I'm personally going back in the office 5 days a week. So it's anybody's guess.
Okay, Brian asks, can we get detailed travel information and not just peak offer and get a lot more data? So hopefully we can do that, and we'll see what we can do about that. Ted, to Arthur, for historical preferences, in the 60s, 70s, didn't ARCA and others sue to prevent the existing elevated Route 1? It was a big deal then, and they went into debt. Does anyone know of that history? Arthur, do you remember that? Do you have that history?
I do not. I only arrived in 1990. And am not aware of it, but I have heard the same rumors, or not rumors, but that ARCA did back in, oh goodness, the 70s and 80s, conduct a fair amount of litigation intended to slow down development primarily in Pentagon City. But beyond that, I'm not familiar with the litigation or its outcome.
I can add to that actually, because I've done a fair amount of research on Arlington history and have read some books about what was going on in that time period. And it was both ARCA and ACA, Aurora Highlands, the two civic associations that existed, because Crystal City wasn't, the civic association wasn't formed until 2014. But they fought against it very strenuously because there was supposed to be an I-595. It was going to be an interstate going right through the middle of Crystal City. And it was all going to be this elevated, I don't forget how many lane highway on that. And the compromise for this was to have the one ramp from 110 come down to grade where it is now with the underpasses. And at the same time, I remember the Americana Hotel lost part of its property as part of that negotiation. So it was a really nasty time period. And it was because of the civic associations largely that the large interstate was not built.
All righty. Again, in the chat, Matt has responded to several people. So be sure and look at, if you ask a question, be sure and look at the chat because there's several comments. On the question, Brandon, I asked, a question of transportation data. Will a transportation analysis input included in the VDOT study? I'm sure it will. I can't say without question it will, but I'd be shocked if it wasn't. So I do expect those projects to be included. Paul, as we know, Route 1 divided the community into two parts, east and west. So the question is not just better connectivity, but how to make city more unified. Is it being considered as well rather than really just easy how to cross the highway? That is definitely one of the, if you looked at the goals at the very beginning, that's definitely one of the goals. And I'm sure that any proposal will take a look at that as one of its priorities. So I think that's going to be included in the study. Yeah, Brandon, yeah, Matt asked Brandon. And Stacy offers to provide a little more history. I'm sure we'll get that in the future. So hopefully we can, Tracy can provide that to us. And Brian asked if for all the transportation on the call, is there anyone want to talk about the trends over the next 20 years, automated vehicles, mobility, micromanaging? Darren, Matt, does anybody want to talk about some of the broad trends in transportation that we might be able to take into account when we think about how to redesign Route 1? Does anyone want to take a whack at that?
I'd like to just add one thing that we've been talking about recently in the working group, and that is to have some kind of local electronic or electric car shuttle that would shuttle around from Crystal City all the way up to Arlington Ridge and come down through Aurora Highlands. Right at the moment, Flair is doing this with its electric cars, but to have something that would provide that connectivity for us and down to the metro would be very useful.
Okay, what other trends in mobility do we see? Darren or Dana, do you want to add?
I can riff on this one for a bit. A huge proportion of our trips every day are under 3 miles. Like, I think it's somewhere in the high 40% on average of most of us. Our car trip is less, or any trip we take is less than 3 miles. And when you look at how Crystal City, Pentagon City, National Landing, the entire area is developing, we're living in the middle of an area where just about everything that you might possibly need, with the possible exception of going into the office, is going to be within that footprint. So a lot of the trends are looking to the most sustainable, but most trying to reduce those trips and put them in a way that's more sustainable and more appropriate to a short trip, rather than taking your personally owned car from your street parking spot by your house or by your building and then parking outside of another building, because the time savings is pretty minimal for that short a trip. The resource consumption of having to provide parking at both ends, the transportation infrastructure to handle your trip, particularly at peak hour, that's a big trend, is trying to find new ways to handle those short trips. A lot of the sort of other things that are coming along, whether it's autonomous vehicles, connected vehicles, the mobility as a service, micromobility, all of those, you're going to see most of the most efficient implementations of those really are going to be to sort of handle those short replicable trips. Doing something like an autonomous shuttle, that's a cool project that is not going to service a 20-mile drive up front. Your most plausible implementation is exactly what Arthur and I believe Carol was talking about, is sort of that intra-neighborhood shuttle. Can that operate autonomously? And is that an option to handle a lot of this national landing traffic?
Okay, Dana, did you have anything to add?
No, I think that in addition to that, just the continuing Arlington's encouragement of things like cycling. Capital Bike Share, it would be great for folks to be able to grab a bike, ride a mile, and then drop it off.
Okay.
So there's a lot of alternatives that they could keep the cars at home in the stable.
Okay. I see most of the questions we have answered. If you have any more questions, I'll give you a couple more minutes to ask a question. Is there, could we ask JBG Trends what's seeing in the private market? That one of the things that just maybe looking at, I don't know if Andy Van Horn is still on. Yes. Andy, did you want to say anything about how JBG looks at this whole area? Or not? It's up to you. Anyway, that's one of the last things. And Paul asked, does anyone know if VDOT is planning to implement traffic signal synchronization, the stretch between 23rd and Glebe, etc.? And if they can't get what they got right, how can they probably only increase delays by adding 2 more signals? I don't know what VDOT's planning. I don't know if anybody else does.
I do not, and I tried to get that information out of VDOT, and they said it's coming, but once we get the study launched, we'll be in a better position to answer your questions. So we are continuing to work in a somewhat data deprived atmosphere, unfortunately.
I know, Paul. Part of the problem is I think 23rd, simply because it runs so many phases. It's at least 4, maybe 5 different phases at 23rd, and so I think it's hard for them to run the same phase, but also have progression run when they've got so many phases going through 23rd. But that's just my off the cuff observation. I think Rob mentions the 23rd Street. A lot of the development, I think, is going to redo a lot of the geometry at 23rd, hopefully in the years to come. So that should help. That should help regardless of what happens with Route 1, changing some of the geometry at 23rd and getting rid of that Clark Bell thing that dumps into that intersection is going to take out a phase or 2 from that operation, and it's going to help them be able to run progression better on Route 1.
Okay, what's the best way to advocate as a whole 202 and get our goals achieved? I sense this is a question, a broad question for Mike Dow. Can you talk to that? I don't know if Mike's on.
Yeah, hey, Eric, sorry, unmuting. Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, there's a couple of ways to do that. That the current effort that we're talking about right now is a really good place to start. As Carol mentioned in the beginning, and she'll remind us at the end, is that this is just the first workshop. There's a lot to take in, and today's meeting was really get everyone aware of the study and what's being done and how the community is starting to think about it. So getting involved in this next workshop is a really great way to go. That said, you know, engaging your civic associations, most of the presidents are online tonight, is another way to go. Talking to your neighbors, going to your county board members, and you know, you'll have opportunity occasionally to talk to the bid or to JBG, and you'll be able to hear their thoughts on it. And so, you know, getting really well informed, because remember, we want this to be really data driven. We are looking to build community here and, you know, increase the connections across all our neighborhoods. And we want a pedestrian friendly, you know, walking friendly neighborhood. And so, you know, having Route 1 be an impediment to achieving that is a really big worry for us. So that's a bunch of ways to stay engaged. But probably the one we'd really value is your contributions to this follow-on workshop. Thanks, Eric.
Okay, Andy Van Horn, would you like to say anything about just how you kind of view this whole area? Maybe a little background if you want.
Sure, thanks, Eric. Hi, everybody. You know, we think of this very holistically, and I know that's the way everybody here is thinking of it as well. And I think we're lucky to be aligned in that, you know, of course, we own a significant amount of property on both sides of Route 1. There are large study areas, you know, one, the sector plan completed, one, the PDSP just getting started. And we are, you know, obviously participating in the PDSP and have a lot of active projects going on in Crystal City. Sorry about the noise in the background. And we just think about Route 1 as, you know, something that can definitely be improved in some way to improve the fabric of connections east-west and to improve how people get around, which is probably less car dependent than ever and probably moving that direction. You know, as we've talked about, we may bring 25,000 Amazon employees here, but we're building no more than 4,000 parking spaces. So, you know, the cars are not going to be a dominant model there. And we see that as something that flows through all of our planning and thinking. But that's kind of the high level for now. And of course, happy to talk next month.
Okay, great. And we do want to note that 23rd Street going to have some changes with Clark Bell, hopefully moving over some. We'll hear more of that later. And personally, I don't, as Rob asked, the 23rd Street, I don't know if anybody knows any more details about the 23rd project. Darren, you briefly mentioned it. I know they're moving Clark over to try to clear up the intersection. I haven't heard exactly what they're doing with that. So, Darren, do you know?
I think it's that whole long range plan and the development that would enable it is under consideration right now through the Block M, I don't know my acronyms, LRPC process. and the 223 Crystal SPRC, and there's one other SPRC. There's a whole overlapping development happening in that 20th to 23rd stretch on the east side that is hopefully going to result in at least interim steps towards getting Clark Bell relocated eastward so it's away from the intersection complex of 23rd and Eads.
Okay. And Ted asks, there have been numerous transportation studies included Route 1 over the last 30 years. Has anyone compiled them, summarized them, conclusion, examined how accurate they are to prove to be and implications for this effort? That's a great question. I suspect the VDOT study was going to do that, try to look at those. I know I have not. I don't think our committee, anybody in our committee has, unless if they have, correct me, please. But I would suspect that the VDOT study will try to summarize all the history in their study. And so that's probably their study, hopefully. Any other questions? I see we're almost at the end of the questions. Mike's asked a question, will be on the west side. Has anyone indicated any preferences? I do not know what Amazon's indicated as far as what's going on. I do not know that. Maybe anybody else, I don't know if anybody else does.
This is Andy again, Eric. I don't think Amazon specifically has any preferences, but we do anticipate, somewhere in the range of 15 to 20% of people living in Arlington, and some, significant portion of them probably wanting to live within biking, walking distance. And it'll be likely what's available and what comes online that meets their supply and demand timeline, frankly, as they get hired and move into the campus.
Perfect. Thank you much.
If I could just add to what Andy just said a moment ago, is that we also would like to take a holistic approach. So with the new people coming in, not just to work, but to live in Crystal City and Pentagon City, all of these issues are going to start to come together, not just Route 1, but it's going to be traffic, it's going to be development, it's going to be open space, it's going to be schools. It's really, really important that we don't piecemeal everything, but that we look everything with the larger area of the density of the population coming in and the traffic to see what is going to be needed in our area.
Okay. With that, is there any last call for questions in the chat? If not, I'll turn it back to Carol for kind of a summary.
Okay, let me go to the last slide then. With there have been a lot of people in and out of this meeting this evening, a lot of residents, a lot of our partners. You just heard from Andy Van Horn from JBG, Rob Mandel and Tracy Gabriel have been in here from the BID as well, Matt Matuzek from the county. There have been other people who have remained quiet while they have been listening to all of this. It's not just something for one group to do. It's not just VDOT, it's not just developers, it's not just commercial, it's not just residents. We all have to be in this together. And this is just the first of what are probably going to be a number of meetings over the course of the next year. We will be posting the materials from this meeting on the Livability 22202 website. It will also go up on the Crystal City Civic Association website and probably the other two civic associations as well. And it should be available, including the recording of this meeting. Now, this is the first time we have successfully managed to record on Facebook. Thank you to Jackie Bianchini, who managed to do that. And hopefully that should be available on Facebook as well afterwards. We will be sending you an email. Everybody who registered, whether they attended or not, is going to get a copy of the online survey, although we've been putting that in the chat room as well, hopefully with no typos in it. And that will be going out by email so that you can provide feedback. The meeting this evening was to be able to maybe stimulate some ideas and some further discussion and just begin the conversation. So any additional comments and suggestions are welcome. As we said before, and as Mike just reiterated, the next workshop meeting, and this will be closer to be a workshop. This evening was really more an informational meeting, as our July 31 was from Livability. But the next Route 1 meeting will be on Wednesday, September 30. Now, it's probable that the VDOT website that Matt Matuszek mentioned will be up by that point. Whether or not they will have begun the community engagement remains to be seen. And whether we will have more specific information from them remains to be seen as well. But we have been asked by the bid if they could use our auspices of Livability 22202 and the 3 civic associations in order to make a presentation. They have done a study themselves about reimagining Route 1, and when we have the meeting on September 30th, we would like to invite them to make that presentation, and we will also go over analysis of the survey results at that point. So I would say with that, unless, yes, I'm supposed to make a shameless plug. Join your local civic association if you haven't yet done so, because we do provide all this information. And those of you who aren't logged in or keyed in through a civic association, Livability 22202 is the work of the 3 civic associations in our zip code: Crystal City, Aurora Highlands, and Arlington Ridge. We've been working together now for about 1.5 years on all of this. And if you go to the livability22202.org website, you will find a lot of information, including the framework that was published last November. That will include the action plan that is part of that as well. And there are a lot of different aspects of this, some of which we have mentioned this evening, but there are others we haven't begun to touch. Schools is another issue. Engaging arts and cultural aspects is another one. So there are a lot of things that are going on. But we urge you all to be engaged and to follow this. And I would like to thank all of the presenters for having made their presentations this evening, and as all of the people who've asked questions or responded to them. So unless there are any other specific things at this point, we will say goodbye, and we will see you at least September 30th, if not before, for the many other meetings that are coming up in September. Thank you and good night.